I honestly think it's important that Troy Bolton was a main character in High School Musical. So often in 2000s movies, they tend to center around someone who is less popular and we see them breaking out of their shell. But I think Troy Bolton represents a very interesting thing here that I don't see people talk about, and I feel like I have just like realized this as I'm revisiting High School Musical. The amazing thing about TV and movies, you can revisit and have a million more things to say, is that Troy Bolton was the most popular kid. He is beloved by everyone, right? And the status quo, right, aims to uphold this hierarchy, right? And so when you, as the most privileged man, right, in your school, breaks that, what happens, right? You are now shattering the order of the way things are supposed to be, the status quo. So when Troy finally auditions, it gets around the school, we get the musical number Stick to the Status Quo, and Chad is like, whoa, you did this and now all of a sudden everybody's confessing. No, you gotta go back to what you were doing. You are just a basketball guy, right? We see Chad panic and he ends up working with Taylor to intimidate Troy and Gabriella to stay in their place, stick to the status quo. But something also interesting to note about Troy is that something that they say throughout the series is that Troy actually has always brought them all together at the end of the day. Isn't that so funny? We're all in this together. So it actually is very interesting also to see someone who is meant to represent this hierarchy in East High, right? He's the captain, he's the popular kid, everyone looks up to him, right? But he also is not like an early 2000s movie like mean guy jock, right? He's very nice. We saw in the scene where Gabriella and Troy ended up singing Kelsey's arrangement of the song, right? That he actually gives credit to Kelsey and kind of puts her situation into basketball terms. It's just like, you're the playmaker. Like, you shouldn't be afraid of Sharpay. Like, without you, there wouldn't be a show, right? We see this kindness that we don't see from, in the way that we see when we think of other 2000s movies, I guess is what I'm saying. And I think this goes to say, when talking about the status quo and understanding how we have all, upheld the status quo at some point in our life, and it's important to deconstruct that and how have we conformed in some way, right? And I think a big thing is, especially when you think of when you're younger, right? In school, in high school, in middle school, right? Where you just want to belong, right? Is it almost easier to fit into a box, although it's easier but not easier, right? And just do what you think you're supposed to do. Because when you go against the grain, you're going to be intimidated and bullied. And Troy was not exempt from that because he was popular, right? It's so interesting because I understand how people tend to go back and conform like Troy did, right? At some point, his friends were attacking him and he was like, you know what? Whatever, didn't care about the girl. Okay, I'm going to the, championship. It's so interesting to show that like this exists on obviously every part of the hierarchy, right? No one is exempt from the pressures of the status quo. And that is something so interesting that I think we need to acknowledge in all of this, and why High School Musical continues to be so interesting to talk about. Like I said, we saw Troy kind of inspire other people to finally admit what they'd like to do, right? Zeke was like, oh, hey, if Troy can sing, I'm just going to tell everyone I also like to cook, right? And that is so interesting to note about the hierarchy in particular, right? Because it'd be different if like a random nerd was like, hey, I also like to sing and I also skateboard, right? That might not have as much leverage, although like maybe it should, right? But Troy Bolton in particular, he had impact, and that was scary because that was shaking up the system that everybody knew, everybody was comfortable with, right? But what's interesting here is that everybody works to maintain the status quo. This is not like a story of someone going against maybe a prince going against the status quo, right? And he has someone higher than him kind of being like, no, 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 you have to do this and do that, right? There isn't really anyone higher than Troy. This is a story of everybody in his life, right? Where if Troy was the most popular kid, right, in this system, everyone in his life was forcing him to stick to the status quo. And that is how powerful this is. If we get people to do the work of the status quo, right, then the big guys at Chop, they just have to sit back and relax, right? Because you're doing their work for them. Someone like Sharpay, right? She represents the status quo of privilege who is now throwing obstacles in their way to make sure that they don't get to the callback audition, right? But Chad and Taylor were already doing the work of the status quo for Sharpay. Sharpay was looking at Chad and Taylor getting together and be like, they're plotting to help out Troy and Gabriella, when really they were plotting to help Sharpay. They didn't know that they were doing that, but that is what was happening. And that's why it's so important, because look what we can accomplish when we learn we're all in this together. We can figure out a way to overcome the obstacles that the status quo puts in place.